chapter 2 this time. I said chapter 2 last time, but I meant chapter 1. So here we go. Here is the picture. Galen had lived in the castle ever since he'd been left, a tiny baby, gurgling in a basket at the main gate. The basket had been carried in to the king, who was very annoyed to see its contents. "Now, by Harry," the king had said with a frown, "I suppose some silly mother thinks I'll adopt this baby and leave the kingdom to him when I die. Well, I won't do it. I expect to have a son of my own someday. Take this baby away and see if one of the kitchen maids will have it." But the prime minister was hovering nearby and sprang forward when he heard what the king was saying. "Please, your majesty, let me have the baby," he said. "I'll take good care of him, and I promise he'll never be a bother to you." "Humph," said the king. "What on earth do you want a baby for? Well, go ahead, take it. Why not?" So the prime minister went joyfully off with the basket, and the king promptly forgot all about it. Now the truth is that Decree was a very lonely man. He had never had a wife, and he lived all by himself in the castle tower. But it wasn't a wife he was lonely for, it was a child. He wanted a child so badly that it kept him awake thinking about it. And when he couldn't sleep, he got overtired and caught colds and went about snuffling, with his beard wrapped around his throat to keep it warm. It made him feel achy and wretched, and when he went to advise the king on important matters, he would say things like "Dowthed" for now then, and "Dot Edibor" for not anymore. When he did this, the king would get cross, and that made the prime minister feel worse than ever. But after the baby came to live with him in the tower, the prime minister slept 9 hours every night without even snoring, and he was never lonely again. So he named the baby Von Galen, which means little healer. It was a very long name, so the baby was mostly called Galen for short, which suited him very well. And as soon as he was old enough, the prime minister taught him to read and write and made him special assistant. And if Galen came to believe that the world was a bright and flawless garden where no weeds grew, a garden in the center of which the castle tower rose high and watchful and serene, it was not to be wondered at. After all, he was cared for very tenderly, with never a wish ungratified, and he and the prime minister loved each other as much as any real father and son since time began. Chapter 3. Here's the picture. That night, the conversation around the king's dinner table was strained. Nobody was letting anybody forget the arguments of the afternoon. "What's for dinner tonight?" said the king to the queen with a broad smile. "Apples, I hope." "Dear me, no," said the queen in a bored tone. "Not apples again. One gets so very tired of them." "Well, at least, seeing as it's nearly spring," said the king through his teeth, "I don't suppose we'll have to sit through a Christmas pudding." The queen turned away with a toss of her head and spoke to the general who sat nearby. "Wine, General?" "Beer or nothing," he answered grimly. Just then the royal dinner was carried in, a huge roast of venison with carrots and potatoes and a variety of fruit in bowls. The guests began muttering to each other about the meal. Everyone was dissatisfied with it in one way or another, but the prime minister rose and bowed to the queen. "An excellent dinner, your majesty," he said politely. I'm sure we will all enjoy it enormously." "Even without fried fish?" asked the queen, glaring at him. "Well, of course," answered the prime minister in an effort to be generous. "One can't eat fried fish every night." "One can't eat fried fish at any night at all unless one is a troublemaking old fool," said the king flatly. The prime minister sat down abruptly and closed his eyes. "Very well, then. came a deep voice from the end of the table. Where are the nuts? The walnuts, the chestnuts, the pecans. It was the voice of Hemlock, a brother to the queen, who stood at his place scowling. Where, I say, are the nuts? We always have nuts for dinner. We never have nuts for dinner, said the king, starting now. Hemlock smiled dangerously. He was a tall, unpleasant man and a friend to no one, not even his sister the queen. He reached into his pockets and pulled out 2 large handfuls of nuts, which he threw high into the air. Then he turned and left the room. The nuts came raining down on the tabletop, splashed into wine, and bounced off the heads of the guests, who rose in a body with a great deal of noise and confusion. When the king had restored order at last, and everyone was sitting down again, he thumped on the table with his fist. See here, he said, this cannot continue. Now, where has Hemlock gone? He looked around, frowning. Well, let him go. Things always seem more peaceful without him. And anyway, Decree started all this, and he'll have to find a way to settle it. He looked at the Prime Minister. Well, he said. Well, said the Prime Minister hopefully, we could just forget all about it. No, said the king, we couldn't. Then, said the Prime Minister, we'll have to find out what everybody thinks and write it all down, and then whatever gets the most votes for delicious will be the thing I use in the dictionary. That's a very good idea, Decree, said the king. Go all around the kingdom and ask everybody. It'll turn out to be apples anyway. Beer, said the general. Pudding, said the queen. The king looked as if he were going to lose his temper. But he gritted his teeth and managed to pull himself together. Start right away on this journey, Decree, he said. There is no time to lose. But I can't go myself, protested the Prime Minister. I'm too old for a long trip like that. Then who shall go? Asked the king in some alarm. Whom can we trust? I'll send my assistant, Von Galen, said the Prime Minister. Well, all right, said the king, as long as he's trustworthy. He's an upright and honest boy, said the Prime Minister firmly, and the apple of my eye. The pudding, murmured the queen. Now by Harry, the king began angrily and then paused. Someone was galloping across the courtyard below and on over the drawbridge. The king went to a window and peered out. There goes Hemlock, he announced. He's riding that big gray horse of his, Ballyrack. Well, maybe he'll stay away. I wish he would, by Harry. He's always trying to take over and run things. He went back to his place at the table and looked severely at the assembled guests. Too many cooks spoil the soup, you know, he said. Too many cooks spoil the pudding, murmured the queen. Aren't they silly? Well, why don't we go on? I guess we're on chapter 4 now. So, let's continue. Here's the picture. The next morning, everyone gathered in the courtyard to see Galen start off. He had been well equipped and instructed by the Prime Minister and knew exactly what to do. There was a large notebook in his saddlebag and pens and ink, the proclamation he was to read to the people, and a map of the kingdom. It was not very large as kingdoms go, perhaps 30 miles square, and there were 4 towns. It was on the basis of this number that Decree and the king had decided to allow 4 weeks to complete the poll. 4 weeks if he's trustworthy, that is, said the king to the Prime Minister, whom he had drawn to one side. I raised him myself, said Decree, and he's true to the core. I hope so, said the king. There's something about this whole business that makes me nervous. You don't need to worry about Von Galen, said the Prime Minister. Well, maybe, said the king said suspiciously. Maybe. What's his choice for delicious? He hasn't said, replied the Prime Minister. Just as well, said the king. He turned back to where Galen sat high on a fine horse, waiting to start off. The horse, whose name was Merrow, was one of the king's best and was draped in the royal colors. Here, boy, said the king to Galen, here's a little something to munch along the way. And he handed up a sack of apples. Galen said thank you and stowed the apples away in his saddlebag alongside the packet of cold fried fish and the sheaf of recipes for Christmas pudding. And now, said the king to the assembled company, before this boy starts out to poll the people, I want to make one thing clear. All of you here at the castle are going to stay here at the castle. There'll be no running ahead to buy up votes for this or that. We'll all stay here quietly for the 4 weeks and we'll talk of other things. That's right, said the Prime Minister. That's the only way to handle it. Good luck, Galen, and I'll send my cockatoo after you with the news each Wednesday and Saturday. You're off then, said the king, and he gave Merrow a slap. The horse went booming over the drawbridge and everybody cheered. They went on cheering until horse and rider had disappeared over a grassy hill and down through a strand of hornbeams, where the first road led to the first town. It all seemed very like a holiday, and Galen, bouncing up and down on Merrow's back, was excited and happy. To ride out on a strong horse and to see the kingdom, this was very fine indeed. You've lived too long here with me in the castle, the Prime Minister had said to him earlier that morning. It will be good for you to go about and see something of what the world is really like while you're still young enough not to get discouraged. Galen had gazed wide-eyed through the tower window at the broad land stretching away toward its ring of mountains through the young green mists of early spring. I don't see why I should get discouraged, he had answered. After all, I'm 12 years old. I know what the world is like, and I can take care of myself. Yes, I suppose you can, said the Prime Minister, laying his arm gently about the boy's shoulders and peering out beside him. Well, well, perhaps I'm only being gloomy. I suppose I'm getting old. He had brightened then and rumpled Galen's hair. You'll have splendid adventures, boy. Let's go and get you ready. And now here he was, jogging briskly along in the golden morning sun, proud and straight in the saddle, ready for anything, he told himself, and hopeful for much. He reached happily into his saddlebag and took out one of the king's apples. But when he bit into it, his teeth struck painfully on something very hard. He drew back sharply and peered at the apple. A portion of the skin had been peeled back, and someone had cut out a bit of the fruit and forced in a walnut. Hemlock, he said to himself. Hemlock did that. He stared at the apple for a moment, and a shivery feeling twinkled down his spine. Then he threw the apple as far as he could into the underbrush and spurred Merrow forward. Silly, he said to himself, and he began to whistle a little tune. The tune was merry, and the morning was sweet, and soon the apple and its burden were far from his mind. Well, there you go, guys. Next, we'll be on to Chapter 4. So I'm going to call it quits for now, but stay tuned. I love you. Bye.